Across America, millions of houses, apartments, farms, and ordinary streets carry completely ordinary histories. People were born there, raised families there, argued over repairs, checked their mail, and went about their daily lives. But scattered across that same landscape are places where something deeply disturbing happened, and then, somehow, life continued. Some buildings were demolished, some were rebuilt, and others simply received new paint and new owners. Yet the history beneath them never completely disappeared. Tonight, we are looking at 13 locations connected to some of America's most notorious crimes. Not to glorify the killers, and not to sensationalize the suffering, but to understand something more unsettling. These places rarely looked frightening. They looked normal. A quiet suburban house, a farm, an apartment building, a motel? And perhaps that is what makes their stories linger long after the headlines have faded. In Chicago, the former home of John Wayne Gacy once stood on an ordinary suburban street. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy murdered dozens of young men and boys, with many victims later discovered beneath the house. The property was demolished in 1979, and a new home was eventually constructed on the land. Even the address was changed, apparently to discourage curiosity seekers. But changing a number cannot erase what happened there. In Wisconsin, Ed Gein's farmhouse became another infamous location. Investigators entered the property in 1957 and discovered evidence of horrifying crimes and grave desecration. The farmhouse later burned, and the remaining structures disappeared over time. Today, the land remains largely undeveloped. There are no dramatic monuments marking the location, just quiet Wisconsin farmland, left largely to nature and memory. Houston had its own nightmare in the early 1970s. Dean Corll appeared to neighbors as a friendly man connected to a candy business. Yet he was responsible for the murders of numerous young men and boys, assisted by 2 teenage accomplices. The crimes were eventually uncovered, but the attention surrounding them faded quickly as the nation became consumed by the Watergate scandal. The house associated with the crimes remained standing, eventually becoming just another maintained property in the neighborhood. California's Yuba City area tells another painful story. Juan Corona operated labor camps and targeted vulnerable farm workers who moved through the region looking for employment. In 1971, 25 men were murdered and buried around the agricultural landscape. The bunkhouse survived in altered form, while the orchards continued to be cultivated for decades. The case also demonstrates how vulnerable people can disappear when society has little infrastructure to notice that they are. Missing Chicago's H.H. Holmes site is different because the original building is gone. Holmes operated a notorious property around the time of the 1893 World's Fair, and newspapers later transformed it into the legend of the murder castle. Holmes confessed to numerous killings. Although historians continue to debate the actual number of victims, the building eventually disappeared, and decades later, a post office was constructed on the site. Then there is Spahn Ranch in California. Once associated with Charles Manson and his followers, the ranch had previously been used as a location for Western productions before becoming a home for Manson's group. After the infamous 1969 murders, the property became part of the larger cultural memory surrounding the case. Fires eventually destroyed the structures, and the land is now within a state historic park. There are no elaborate signs announcing what happened there. In Salt Lake City, Ted Bundy rented a room in a quiet residential building in 1974. 2 neighbors. He could appear like an ordinary, well-dressed tenant, yet investigators later connected him to numerous murders across several states. The building itself survived, continuing as a residential property. People walk along the same streets, live nearby, and carry on with ordinary routines without necessarily thinking about the history attached to the address. Milwaukee's Oxford Apartments tell a different story because the building no longer exists. Jeffrey Dahmer lived there before his arrest in 1991, and the property was demolished the following year after owners and city officials struggled to find anyone willing to live there. Today, the location is simply an open grassy lot. There is no imposing structure, no dramatic landmark only an absence where a building once stood. Gary Ridgway's former home in Auburn, Washington, is perhaps disturbing precisely because it looked so ordinary. Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, lived there while committing a long series of murders. Neighbors remembered him as quiet and unremarkable, someone who maintained his yard and exchanged casual greetings. The house remains standing and occupied, creating an unsettling contrast between its ordinary appearance and the terrible history associated with its former resident. Dennis Rader, known as BTK, created an even stranger contrast. He was a husband, homeowner, church leader, and community figure, while secretly committing murders in the Wichita area. His ranch-style home in Park City still stands, and its current residents are simply people trying to live normal lives. That distinction matters. A building does not inherit guilt from the person who once lived inside it. The history belongs to the past, even when the address remains. Eileen Warnes's final known address was a motel in Ormond Beach, Florida, along a stretch of highway that still looks remarkably ordinary. Her crimes occurred along Florida's highways in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Yet the roads, exits, and surrounding landscape remain. The motel was renovated and continued operating, while the world around it simply moved forward. There is something haunting about how physical places can survive long after the people and events that made them infamous have disappeared. Then, there is 35 Pine Street in Yonkers, associated with David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. His shootings terrified New York City during the 1970s and triggered one of the city's largest manhunts at the time. Berkowitz was eventually arrested, and some of his explanations for the crimes became infamous in their own right, but the apartment building remained. It is still simply a brick residential building on an ordinary street, easy to pass without ever knowing what happened there. At number 1 is the Villisca Axe Murder House in Iowa, connected to one of America's most infamous unsolved family murders. In June 1912, Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, and 2 young overnight guests were killed inside the home. The investigation never produced a definitive answer, and although Reverend Lynn George Kelly was tried twice, he was acquitted both times. More than a century later, the central question remains unresolved. Unlike many locations on this list, the Villisca House still resembles its historical appearance and has been operated as a tourist destination and overnight rental. Paranormal investigators have visited it and reported unusual experiences, though such claims remain matters of belief rather than established fact. What is certain is much simpler and much sadder. 8 people lost their lives there, and nobody was definitively held responsible. When you put all 13 locations together, a pattern begins to emerge. Some were demolished, some were rebuilt, some remain occupied, others are nothing more than empty land. Yet their physical appearances rarely match the darkness of their histories. A quiet street can hide a terrible past just as easily as an abandoned building can, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of these stories. There were no warning signs telling people that something terrible was happening behind those doors. Neighbors still went to work, cars still passed, mail was delivered, lawns were maintained, children went to school. Ordinary life continued alongside extraordinary tragedy, often without anyone realizing what was happening. These places remind us that true crime is ultimately not about buildings. It is about people, the victims whose lives were taken, the families left behind, and the communities forced to live with memories they never asked for. A house can be repainted, a street number can change, a building can be demolished and replaced, but none of those things can rewrite history. So the next time you drive through an ordinary neighborhood, remember the lesson hidden inside these 13 stories. Darkness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it exists behind the most ordinary door on the most ordinary street. And when the headlines disappear and decades pass, the world may look completely normal again, but the stories of the people who suffered there still deserve to be remembered with dignity, not forgotten simply because the buildings remained.